Hi. So, Charles Bukowski died about 20 years ago. He was revered by Hollywood's Illuminati, by the intelligentsia. People like Sean Penn, Johnny Depp, Bono. They revered the guy for his truth, his realness, but also his surliness and depravity. This is a weird poem. It's one of the very few poems I know by anybody that's self-referential, meaning he says his own name in the middle of the poem, which is narcissistic, which is another thing that Bukowski was. There was a movie made about him, loosely based on him, called Barfly back in the 80s with Mickey Rourke, who was a far more attractive person than the real Bukowski was. And as it turned out, I think that's what made him sort of famous. It made him beloved by people out in California. And if you ever listen to him speak, like on the Extra Credit Project, I've got a question about the documentary Born Into This about Bukowski. He does have that weird, kind of whiny California accent a little bit. You'll see it. You'll know what I'm talking about. It doesn't fit the person. But the guy was, to quote my grandfather's obituary, a factotum. Meaning he had all sorts of weird, odd jobs because he couldn't keep many jobs because he gambled and he drank and he stayed on the seamy side of life, and that's what his poetry is about. This might be the least obscene poem I know by Bukowski, and I think that's why I threw it in here, just because he's such a pop culture icon, or at least has been, and not in the past 20 years. I wanted to compare him to the classics. The poem is called I Am Visited by an Editor and a Poet. And again, I like Bukowski's work, but I also do kind of get sick of him because he is sort of the hipster's hipster. And when somebody tries too hard to keep it real, sometimes they don't. And I think he tries to pose a little bit in this poem, and I think in a lot of his poetry. So I just won $115 from the Head Shakers and was naked upon my bed, listening to an opera by one of the Italians, and had just gotten rid of a very loose lady when there was a knock upon the wood. And since the cops had just raided a month or so ago, I screamed out rather on edge, "Who the hell is it? What do you want, man?" So already the guy's making us think he's a badass. You know, he's got beer cans on the floor, we'll see in a minute. He's classy, he's listening to opera, but at the same time his apartment's filthy. There's just been probably a prostitute or close to a prostitute in his company. The cops frequently raid his complex. So he's, you know, living on the edge, as he says. He says, I screamed out rather on edge, but he's living on the fringes. I'm your publisher, somebody screamed back, and I hollered, I don't have a publisher. Try the place next door. And he screamed back, you're Charles Bukowski, aren't you? And I got up and peeked through the iron grill to make sure it wasn't a cop, and I placed a robe upon my nakedness, kicked a beer can out of the way, and bade them enter, an editor and a poet. So, you know, he's so wild and out of control, he doesn't even realize he has his own publisher. And it may not be that he has a publisher, but this guy wants to be his publisher. This is a poem about the meeting of the commercial and the creative, I think. It also dwells upon something we've talked about in class, selling out. Something that happens quite frequently. So, only one would drink a beer, the editor. So I drank two for the poet and one for myself. And they sat there sweating and watching me, and I sat there trying to explain that I wasn't really a poet in the ordinary sense. I told them about the stockyards and the slaughterhouse and the racetracks and the conditions of some of our jails. And the editor suddenly pulled out 5 magazines out of a portfolio and tossed them between the beer cans. And we talked about Flowers of Evil, Rimbaud, Villon, and what some of the modern poets look like. J.B. May and Wolfe the Headley are very immaculate, clean fingernails, etc. I apologized for the beer cans, my beard, and everything on the floor. Torn stockings under the bed and dirty fingernails. I'm selling rhyme and life and line. And I walked over and cracked a new can of beer, and I looked at the 5 magazines with my name on the cover, and I wondered what it meant. Wondered if we were writing poetry or all huddling in one big tent clasping assholes. So these guys are trying to use Bukowski's fame or notoriety or maybe rising star to sell their magazines. And he's trying to tell them I'm not like these other guys. You know, I don't clip my nails and I look horrible. I look like I just rolled out of a beast cave. Because his ethos, if it were to be summed up in a line of this poetry, I told them about the stockyards and the slaughterhouse and the racetracks and the conditions of some of our jails. That's what he knows about. He doesn't know about romance. He doesn't know about these really sort of elevated things. He writes about the ditch. Yeah, he writes about bars, and the bars he writes about, they're not, you know, the wine room and the Five Seasons. These are like dirty. It's like this room I'm sitting in right now, just a shack somewhere with really dirty glasses and cheap draft beer. That's the sort of people that Charles Bukowski affiliated with. But yeah, Los Angeles, loved by the intelligentsia, the seamy and the surly side of life. And if you do remember one thing from this, the first line, and I've always wondered who the head shakers are supposed to be. I've wondered if it was people that had such bad alcoholism that when they weren't drinking, they were shaking with the delirium tremens, or just naysayers, bookies maybe, who constantly shake their heads, either at the rampantness of wanton gambling or trying to convince people not to take the right bet. I've looked, I've never figured it out. So, on a different note, someone else who was probably equally as mentally, I don't want to say challenged, but somebody who had mental issues like Bukowski may have had. If Bukowski was a narcissist and an alcoholic and an inveterate gambler, Edgar Allan Poe, the word that's used to describe him most frequently is macabre, M-A-C-A-B-R-E. It means creepy. And most of his poem deals with death, or, let's put it this way, I often teach Poe's poetry, and I ask students on the 300 level, or 200 level rather, is Poe, from his poetry, obsessed with women, death, or dead women? And most people wind up saying dead women. And this is a classic example of that, just like The Raven. It's called Annabel Lee, and it's probably after The Raven, his most famous and most published poem. And it's creepy. The cool thing about it is it's got some neat poetic devices. It's got this repetition that sort of infers insanity and paranoia. It's got internal rhymes. Some of the rhymes actually have rhymes within the lines. You can see it sort of, it starts with a rhyme scheme that eventually starts to dissipate as it deteriorates more and more into the paranoid. And by the end, you understand why. The guy, he's good at putting paranoia in the lines of poetry. You see this poem, like the poet, devolve. And, you know, if you've ever seen the movie The Raven with John Cusack, it romanticizes the death of Poe, but, I mean, it was probably a very ugly, surly, seamy, dirty death. He probably did overdose on a park bench. It's a good movie. It romanticizes the guy and embellishes fictionally a little bit about his life. But one thing it gets very true, he was not well known in life. People read his stuff, his serial work in newspapers, and it wasn't until after his death that it was all put in a compendium, and that's when his notoriety, his fame came to be. Now, there's a long-standing myth, legend if you will, that Annabel Lee was a girl from Charleston, because if you don't know it, Poe was actually stationed on Sullivan's Island back in the 1820s. He was a grunt, he was a soldier out in what was then a very wild wilderness. I mean, we know, I think, historically that Poe used the topography of Sullivan's Island for The Gold Bug, his novella, his treasure hunt novella, as I like to call it. But it's very unlikely that a soldier would have been able to get from that mire, that boondock, maritime forest outpost on Sullivan's Island into the city to cultivate a relationship with a Rhett or a Ravenel. And the reason people use Charleston in that myth or that legend, that apocryphal tale, is because of phrases like highborn kinsman and kingdom by the sea. You know, he was right across the harbor from Charleston, and it was incredibly wealthy. It was at the peak of its financial zenith when he was living out on Sullivan's Island. But it seems very unlikely, most people disagree, those who know Poe historically, that this was a girl from Charleston. I might be wrong, but it doesn't matter. It starts out in a very classical sense, and it seems almost like a romantic ballad from the medieval times. Annabel Lee is the name of the poem, if I didn't say it earlier. It was many and many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. Again, you hear that repetition, you hear the word me used several times. Annabel Lee is used in every stanza of this poem. And again, I think it sort of implies to me a withering sanity. But they're in a kingdom by the sea. She's a maiden. It is medieval in a way. It seems like a poem set in the days of chivalry. I was a child and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea, but we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabel Lee. With a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. I mean, you'll see loved, love, and love in the same line. That triple repetition in the same line. You'll also see that little mark over the E in winged, making it winged, to give it not only the proper amount of syllables Poe wants, but to, I don't know, again, bring it to that sort of Elizabethan stage in regards to the diction. So, this particular poem right here, you see the paranoia building. Their love is so strong that the angels, the seraphs up in heaven, are coveting how beautiful this love is between these two children, these two young people, the poet and Annabel Lee. And this was the reason that long ago in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of a cloud, chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee, so that her highborn kinsman came and bore her away from me to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. A longer stanza you'll see in this kingdom by the sea twice. You'll see, of course, her name mentioned again. But the conspiracy theory has begun, if we want to talk content, not style or form. The clouds were a hitman sent by the angels in heaven to take her out because of the jealousy they had, because of how much they coveted this love affair. And again, he almost seems to be indicting the highborn kinsman, her relatives, for taking her body away once she passed, which we know from discussing Faulkner, you don't keep the body around. I mean, when somebody dies, you bury them or you let them be consumed by flame. The angels, not half so happy in heaven. I'll read that again, but man, that's a triple shot of alliteration right there. Half so happy in heaven. I like that. The angels, not half so happy in heaven when envying her and me. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know in this kingdom by the sea, that the wind came out of the cloud by night, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. Like he's trying to convince himself by saying yes with an exclamation point behind it. I'm right. That's why they did it. They were all jealous. Not only the angels, but the demons below the sea as well, he mentions in the next line, the next stanza. Mother Nature and all of these entities, deific entities, good and bad, are conspiring against these two. If that's not paranoia, I don't know what is. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of many far wiser than we, and neither the angels in heaven above, nor the demons down under the sea can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. Those last two lines in that stanza are acrobatic. They're gymnastic almost. Can ever dissever my soul from the soul. You've got that ever and soul twice. A double internal rhyme. And again, you see that he's laid out on paper the vastness of this conspiracy. Everything up there, everything down there, they're all against us, and that's why it happened. They didn't like our love, and they decided to hire a hitman who disguised himself as a cloud to take us out. The last stanza, though, the deterioration ends, and we get sort of, again, a confirmation of the poet's insanity. Be it from grief or be it from paranoia, I don't know. But what he does at the end of this thing is not natural. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And the stars never rise, but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so, all the night tide I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her sepulchre, there by the sea, and her tomb by the sounding sea. Poe, being macabre, often uses the most, probably the darkest synonym he can for grave. He uses sepulcher, which even the sound of it is creepy, morose. And there's a ton of alliteration, there's a ton of internal rhyme in this thing, like rise and eyes. But the kicker, we find out that they're still together. She's dead, but he still sleeps by her side in that tomb right on the shore side of this kingdom by the sea. He has separation issues. His paranoia is just a mere small part of his mental issues. He cannot disconnect. But remember, please remember that Poe did live on Sullivan's Island in the U.S. Army. And if you ever drive out to Sullivan's, or if you live out there, or go to the beach out there, the library is named at the school there is named after him. There's several streets, Poe and Ion. There's a great little restaurant out there called Poe's. Anyway, they pay homage to the man. He's possibly one of the most famous residents out there in the island's history. Now, I think by default everybody knows Lewis Carroll. They know him because they know either from cartoon or reading, or even a more dramatic presentation of Alice in Wonderland. He's the author of that. And Jabberwocky, which is a poem filled with nonsensical words and images and non-existent beasts, is a poem within a section of Alice in Wonderland. It's actually told by Humpty Dumpty. And Lewis Carroll actually made up a word, or a phrase, a poetic device, portmanteau words. I'll give you a good example of one. Smoke, fog, put them in a little suitcase and crunch them together, you've got smog. You know, a portmanteau was the kind of valise or traveling case that somebody would have brought on board the Titanic for a long journey. And if you take two words and crunch them together in that box, you've got a word like, slithy, in the first line of Jabberwocky, which is, according to the poet, slimy and lithe combined. It doesn't make a lot of sense because they're very incongruous words, but it's an easy poem to identify because, except for with just a few exceptions, almost every line has a word that doesn't exist anywhere else outside of the world of the Jabberwock or outside of Alice in Wonderland. But the beautiful thing about a lot of these words is you can still kind of figure out the context of them. They're very alliterative, they're very onomatopoeic, I guess is the best way to say it, like the word uffish. Kind of sounds like elfish. But it does begin, it's bookmarked, with the same stanza beginning and end, like a classical ballad, a heroic epic. And it's Beowulf condensed. I mean, it's a short version of the classic tale we all know and love. The underdog going out to slay the beast to save everybody. If you look at the pictures on D2L, there's some prints that show the hero of this poem as a little girl, Alice maybe. Others say it's just a little boy with long hair. I don't think it matters much, but let's talk about it. Again, these words, even though they're made up, they do a bit resemble Old English in a sense. "'Twas brillig in the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe, all mimsy were the borogroves and the mulm's wrath outgrabe." Gyre and gimble is one of literature's most famous examples of alliteration right there, that double G sound. And I don't know if he's relating to us status quo or if he's just giving us a setting. These are the people that are anticipating death from the Jabberwock. And again, this is a poem, not a story or a novel, so it cuts straight to the chase. "Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the Jubjub bird, and shun the frumious Bandersnatch." So, not only out there in the woods is this Jabberwock, and you see a picture of what the Jabberwock looks like from Carroll's mind's eye, but also, you know, the Jubjub bird and the frumious Bandersnatch. There's other villainous creatures out there in the woods, in the forest. By the way, if you're a fan of The Simpsons, Marge's two sisters, Patty and Selma, have a pet iguana named Jubjub, in tribute to this poem, I think. "He took his vorpal sword in hand, long time the manxome foe he sought. So rested he by the tumtum tree and stood a while in thought. So he's begun the journey already, and his vorpal sword, I've always imagined, has a curve to it, or has little notches on it, because when he pulls it out of the slain beast, it makes a sort of a sucking noise, like it's not a straight blade. It's not something that exists in the world of cutlery or bladesmithing, but it's a word that he made up. It seems almost a combination of ancient and futuristic. And as in uffish thought he stood, the Jabberwock with eyes of flame came whiffling through the tulgey wood and burbled as it came. Burbled sounds like a combination of burping and garbled, all kind of mixed in together. But yeah, you see, we're 4 stanzas in, and the Jabberwock and our hero are already face to face. There's not a whole lot of exposition in this thing. We're getting straight to the action. And again, uffish. Contemplative, but in a small way, like an elf thinking maybe. That's what I see. I'll give you my impression of some of these words, because you develop them over the course of time reading a poem like this many, many times. The next stanza is the kill shot. 1, 2, 1, 2, and through the vorpal blade went snicker-snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing back. Love the word galumphing. Galloping triumphantly, like a little kid running in his dad's boots. And, you know, he killed it. Again, we don't see a lot of competition. We don't see a lot of aggression coming from the Jabberwock. But he kills it. That vorpal sword is pretty slick. And proof of death, he cuts its head off to bring back so everybody can sleep at night, knowing that this thing will not fire upon them again. He gets back to the village, and this dialogue happens. "And hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy, O frabjous day, Callooh Callay." He chortled in his joy. Chortled's a real word. It sounds like it's a made-up portmanteau, but it really is a real word. But Callooh Callay, even though I think made up by Lewis Carroll for this poem, has become its own little exhortation of celebration. I've heard people say Callooh Callay well out of the bounds of the poem Jabberwock, the Jabberwocky. So, beamish is a great word too. I've not heard it ever outside of this poem, but when someone beams, it's usually with pride or happiness. And you can imagine he is proud. He's done the deed. Heck, he's done a fool's errand. They probably thought he was going to come back or never come back or be slain, but he did it. And it ends the same way it began. Even though we've got the same setting, you can kind of figure out that things have come back to normal in a sense. The village is the way it was. The setting is the way it was before the troubles began. "'Twas brillig in the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave, all mimsy were the borogroves and the mome rats outgrabe." Back to normal. That bookmark. So, no Lewis Carroll's connection to Alice in Wonderland. Know that Humpty Dumpty is the original speaker, the narrator of this poem. Know also the portmanteau word phraseology I mentioned earlier. Portmanteau, P-O-R-T-M-A-N-T-E-A-U. Taking 2 words and squeezing them together to come up with a new word. And again, vorpal blade, gyre and gimble. Again, if there is a test in this class regarding poetry, I'm debating that now. I would never give a definition of alliteration. I'd always give an example. And as I said, the most famous that I know is gyre and gimble from the second line of the first and last stanza. But one thing people have done in regards to the poetry anthology that's coming up on the last day of class, they've done this. Poems I love, poems I hate, but some people have done children's poems or silly poems, poems that have nonsensical words in them, and have used this one. So, you know, this could work despite its nature and its made-up words. It could work in a lot of different contexts. Now, email me or go to D2L to the discussion page if you have any questions about Bukowski, Poe, or Lewis Carroll. Thanks, guys.